Welcome to you, welcome everyone to the Spring 2023 edition of Idea Factory. Over the past several years, we have had many distinguished speakers share their thoughts and ideas through this forum, supported by our Inclusive Excellence Grant. The grant is given to us from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Today, we have another distinguished speaker, Dr. Terrell Morton. Dr. Morton is an assistant professor of identity and justice in STEM education in the Department of Educational Psychology in the College of Education at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Dr. Morton graduated with a BS in chemistry from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, an MS in neuroscience from the University of Miami, and a PhD in education, concentration learning science studies from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. Morton identifies as a scholar activist. His research and work focus on identity as it reforms the persistence and engagement of racialized and minoritized students in STEM post-secondary education. He draws from critical race theory, phenomenology, and human development to ascertain Black students' consciousness and how it manifests in their various embodiments and actions that facilitate their STEM post-secondary engagements. Dr. Morton is highly accomplished in the arena of securing external funding for his research. He has received several grants from the National Science Foundation, both as a PI and a co-PI. Most recently, as a PI, he secured over $8 million from the NSF for a project entitled Racial Equity, Examining Blackness in Post-Secondary STEM Education Through a Multi-Dimensional Multiplicative Lens. It is an honor to present to you our speaker, esteemed guest, friend, and colleague, Dr. Terrell Morton.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. How's everybody feeling today? Are we warm enough? No? Got to add a couple more layers? Hey, I completely understand. Well, one, thank you all so much for having me. It is my honor and pleasure to be here at LTU speaking to you today. Thank you so much, Bujo, for the invitation, as well as the other members of the HHMI committee. It has been a great experience so far. I've had a great opportunity to meet with different stakeholders on campus and to learn a little bit more about the LTU context, some of the things that you all are working towards, particularly within the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as some of the things that you aspire to obtain, even as you all are deeply entrenched within this work. And so I'm excited to be able to just share with you all some ideas based off of my own research, based off of my own experience, as well as some of the information that I've gathered here today as I talk on this topic of seeking justice and joy, facilitating institutional cultural change in an era of anti-Blackness. I tend to be very interactive and engaging with my presentations, and so I'm going to be asking you all to sort of respond to some of the different things that I put up. One of the first things is this question that I'm going to ask: what do you see? And so as I put different images up on the board, I'm going to ask you to report out loud what it is that you see. First image. What do you see? Maleficent, Angelina Jolie. What else do we see? Horns. Cheekbones, red lipstick. Anything else? Lady in the back. What are we assuming is taking place within this particular image? War. Evil. Medieval. Medieval. What else? Hero. Power. Threat. How many of us are familiar with the animated version of Sleeping Beauty? In the animated version of Sleeping Beauty, this character, Maleficent, represents what? evil, villain. We are taught in this animated version of Sleeping Beauty that Maleficent is this evil witch who has come to curse innocent Aurora, putting her into an eternal slumber until Prince Charming can come and awaken her with her kiss. We're told that Maleficent was upset, spoiler alert, because she was not invited to the party. And so she's going to come now and enact her wrath and her terror on this family, cursing this innocent child. As children, we're socialized to fear Maleficent. We're socialized to hate Maleficent. We're socialized to believe that Maleficent embodies all things evil. But in this live-action remake starring Angelina Jolie, for those who saw it, what is it that we learn about Maleficent's story? More complex. Any other Disney fans? Even though it's a little problematic. More relatable. Yes. She walks what? She belongs to a special race. Another spoiler alert. We learned that Maleficent was living in fairy world among fairy people. She was living in her own community, operating amongst her own group, when an outcast from human world, Stephen, was taken into this fairy community, raised as a friend of Maleficent, potentially romantic partner. We never really get that clarity in the storyline. And then as Stephen decides to return to human world and establish himself in this space, his first act to prove his power and dominance is to colonize fairy world, because the humans were afraid of what the fairies could do and their capacity. And so Maleficent then has to take on this persona, literally transforming herself to be larger, to reflect humans, adopting this more black-esque attire, and taking on power to protect her people and to fight against the colonizers. She then does go and curse Aurora, like the rest of the animated story shares. But we actually find out, more spoiler alerts, that it was Maleficent's love that breaks the curse and not Prince Charming. And so in this live action version of Sleeping Beauty, or Maleficent, we actually learned that the true villain in the story was the king. His quest to colonize and to obtain power and to exert himself as a dominant force, disrupting the lives of everyone else. Yet despite this storyline, when we see this image, we automatically associate Maleficent with evil. We automatically assume that Maleficent is embodying fear and terror and anxiety. And so as I bring this back, spending a lot of time talking about Disney, to this question of what do you see, I ask that not just about what do we see with regards to fictitious characters, but what is it that we see when we engage people who are different from us? What is the lens by which we make assumptions of who a person is, what a person represents, and to what capacity that person is operating? And not just in our everyday lives, but particularly within our classroom spaces. And the degrees to which we see the behaviors and the responses that people are embodying as challenges, or whether or not we understand the backstories of people that people might be navigating on a day-to-day experience. And so it's this concept then that perception, perspective, or even our positioning is informed by our knowledge, experiences, beliefs, and characters. It shapes then our experiences and relationships, influencing our interactions and our behaviors and our engagements with others. We thought Maleficent was evil because we were socialized to believe that black represents darkness. We were socialized to believe that black represents the absence of color or light. We are socialized to believe that Maleficent represented evil because of the juxtaposition between a blonde, blue-eyed white woman and what whiteness is supposed to represent in terms of purity. But what's really interesting is, in understanding and diving into our perceptions, thinking then that we're making assumptions of other people, what we're actually doing is demonstrating our own biases, lived experiences, perspectives of the world, and understanding. And so that begs us to then ask the question, who am I? What do I see? What do I believe? What do I value? And why is it that I operate from this perspective? So if I were to answer the question, who am I could talk about my educational pedigree. And I could tell you about my bachelor's in chemistry from the illustrious North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, or the PhD program that I started in neuroscience at the University of Miami before mastering out of that program and enrolling and completing a PhD at UNC Chapel Hill in the learning sciences and psychological studies. But even more importantly, I think about who am I in terms of my speaking and interactions, coming from a very loving, very rich and robust family where I have cousins up in the back over here supporting me, so I'm super excited to see them. Recognizing the legacies of our family and what they represented during the times in which they were raised, and the voices and perspectives that they advocated for through their different industry, and how that then informs my own approach to scholar activism and the ways in which I try to show up for my people. And so I think then through this concept of my positionality, recognizing that the identities that I inhabit, born with, acquire over time, inform the various privileges that I maintain. I am blessed to be able to say that I am a fourth generation college graduate, as their grandfather, my great-grandfather, attended North Carolina A&T when it was a school for Negro farmers. Their parents, my grandparents, attended HBCUs, allowing us to go to school and me to go to school, which is not a very common story for people who can trace both sides of their ancestry to enslavement in the United States. Those privileges have afforded me the opportunity to be exposed to different walks of life, gathering different forms of awareness that then inform the commitments that I make in terms of what I do, why I do it, but even more importantly, the actions that I show, recognizing that I can say a whole bunch of things, but if my actions don't follow behind the things that I say, then some would call that hypocritical. So my positionality encompasses all of these perspectives: who I am, what I've been exposed to, the privileges I maintain, the commitments that I make, and most important, the actions that I embody. And it's guided primarily through these two overarching theoretical frameworks: Phenomenological variant ecological systems theory, which is a long title, and when I first read it in graduate school, I threw the paper aside and said I would never pick it back up again, and look at me now. And then critical race theory, which has been very popular in the more recent media, and I will attempt to give you all a sort of baseline understanding of what critical race theory represents, so that as you continue to be exposed to these perspectives, you can go and explore primary sources for yourself to develop then an understanding of what the framework introduces. In essence, phenomenological variant ecological systems theory talks about two main ideas. What is the ecosystem, our micro, meso, exo, and macro systems that inform the ways in which we understand and navigate life? And then what is the phenomena that we are experiencing, given our net vulnerability or our identities, the stressors that we navigate on a day-to-day basis, both good and bad, the reactive coping mechanisms that we produce to those stressors, and how if we constantly make the same decisions to stressors, we then develop an identity for ourselves, or we have an identity projected onto us that then inform our life stage outcomes, where we're able to go, what we're able to do as a result of our decisions and the way that people respond to us. Which in continuing the cycle then says, how does that inform future stereotypes, biases, and beliefs about people who inhabit the identities that we maintain? Critical race theory is a framework that is very intentional about exposing the permanent and endemic nature of structural racism, particularly within the United States, given the ways in which this country has been founded, the facts that it was built off of the attempted extermination of indigenous people inhabiting these lands, and the forced enslavement of African bodies brought to these lands, and how that history situates our social, cultural, political understandings of life, both in terms of our laws, policies, and our procedures, but also our conceptions of normality. For example, in this room right now, only some people can access it. Who can't access this room? People who are differently able. We make the assumption that everybody can walk on two legs with no assistance, and so we have these phenomenal staircases that grant access or constrain access because of our conceptions of normality that we don't necessarily interrogate on a day-to-day basis. Critical race theory gives us that power, and a way that I help explain it is then through this metaphor. If you're walking along a body of water and you happen to see one fish belly side up, what question do you think most people ask? Is it dead?
What is wrong with the water?
Maybe what's wrong with the water? What killed the fish? A lot of questions tend to focus on the fish, right? All the other fish are fishing, and this one little fish is not fishing appropriately according to what we think fishes are supposed to do. So we're going to ask, typically, what's wrong with the fish? Now, I love presenting this to scientists because scientists automatically go to the ecosystem. But if we were all happening to walk along a body of water, and we were to see hundreds of thousands of fish manifesting this kind of behavior, what kind of question do you think we would ask? What's wrong with the water? What's wrong with the lake? Why are all of these fish performing in this particular capacity? Critical race theory gives us that power to say that about racism. And rather than thinking about racism as these individual acts of hate committed by somebody with the intent on committing crimes, we can look at the legacy of this country. We can look at the laws, the policies, the procedures, the practices, the conceptions of normality that undergird the ways in which we operate. And we can shift from this individualistic perspective to then ask questions about the ecosystem. What is wrong with the ecosystem that continues to allow people to be subjugated to different experiences on the basis of their race? And how then does that intersect with their gender, sexuality, religion, physical and neurological ability, or even socioeconomic status and class? And even more powerful than asking questions about racism, critical race theory gives us the ability to ask those same questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of who is in the room and why. And instead of thinking about what's wrong with someone, why are they not present in this space, we can ask, what is it about this ecosystem that has facilitated the lived experiences that produce inequities in representation, numerically, ontologically, epistemologically, and axiology, for those of you who took philosophy. And so critical race theory gives us the power to ask deeper questions, to look beyond the surface of what is transpiring and ask, what are those roots? What are these mental models and schemas that are driving the practices, that are driving the outcomes, that are driving the experiences? I take this theory, critical race theory, and phenomenological variant ecological systems theory to ask questions about Black student experiences in STEM. And so when I look at the data, kind of small here, from the National Center of Educational Statistics, our 2023 Science and Engineering Indicators, the data points to 4-year science and engineering degrees awarded by race since 2000, all the way up until 2019, where the yellow line represents those individuals who are American Indian or Alaska Native. The red line represents individuals who are of Hispanic or Latinx origin. The blue line represents Black or African American. And the green line represents Asian or Pacific Islander. Interesting to see which racial identity is not there. Again, conceptions of normality though, right? We would automatically assume these are in respect to white. But when we look at the data and we look at the trend, and we think about it in comparison to data that talks about interest in majoring in STEM, people who would enter into school, universities in fall 13, would have graduated by 2017, 2018, or 19 if they're on the 4, 5, or 6-year plan. And we can see that despite 23% of Black students expressing interest in majoring in STEM, we are consistently awarding 9% of our degrees to Black populations. And so that begs me to question what's happening between the time in which Black students enter into our university spaces and then exit our university spaces that would take us from 23% to 9%, where 9% has been consistent for almost 30 years. 9% is underrepresentation compared to national demographics, where Black people represent around 14% of the United States. So they're already underrepresented in STEM. But now we have to ask what is actually happening that's leading to this underrepresentation, given the fact that they start overrepresented in exploring these spaces. And so the research literature talks about the racialized and gendered experiences that Black students, that's a little too far, sorry, got a little excited there, that Black students experience in STEM, the challenges that they have with representation and voice, how there's heightened negative social, emotional feelings that are taking place within their classroom spaces, their peer interactions, their research labs, their university spaces, where they express the beliefs of constantly having to monitor and moderate their identities in order to exist within these spaces, assimilating aspects of who they understand they are, rejecting aspects of who they understand who they are, in order to fit within how we have conceived STEM learning spaces. And we also understand from the more strengths-based approach that they're very intentional in the resources that they're navigating and leveraging, because they have these aspirations for what STEM represents for them and how they can use it in their own professional experiences. So this research speaks to Black student experiences in STEM, but now let's contextualize it in life 2020 and beyond. So now we get to see Cardi B, who told us what? Coronavirus, ish is real, ish is getting real. And it changed the entire landscape of how we've understood life, social interactions, and engagements. but it also forced the world to sit down and contend with the continued perpetuation of racism and hostility against black bodies, as we were made to watch for 8 minutes the injustices that transpired against George Floyd, that led to an eruption of how people continuously were decrying, do Black Lives Matter? Thinking beyond George Floyd into other experiences such as Breonna Taylor, or even before with Sandra Bland, or even before, and I can go all the way back to Emmett Till, or even before, right? Asking this question, do Black Lives Matter? Where as a community and as a people, we decided to at least publicly say, Black Lives Matter. We painted it on the streets of Washington, D.C. We changed some of the names of our streets to represent and celebrate some people. And then we got to January 6, 2021, where there was an attempted insurrection against the United States because there were a group of people who were not happy with the way that the democratic process turned out, and were very intentional in the ways in which they assaulted black bodies and black people during their demonstrations of their beliefs and their perspectives. This is then followed by political attacks against black being, black knowledge, and black history, where we're now seeing states being intentional to ban perspectives of black lived experiences that have transpired in this nation or beyond. Nice little map across the United States of legislation depicting whether or not we can teach black history. And not just black history, anything related to social emotional learning, anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of these things are up for debate, where some states have intentionally said and have already started to disbar programs that are engaging in this work. And so if I think about black in 2023, I then go back to this and ask, what do you see? Or what would you expect to see if all of these perspectives are constantly operating on people as they are navigating their STEM experiences? But taking it out of looking at the person and then asking questions about you, how do you then see yourself in other people's stories? What is important about this new middle image? Who can tell us about this storyline? I saw a nice, beautiful painting of the original person, not Taraji, in the hallways a little earlier. Katherine Johnson. Who is Katherine Johnson? Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, Dorothy Vaughan, 3 black women who were instrumental in NASA's launch of John Glenn into space, orbiting the Earth and returning. Most notably recognized as our, quote, hidden figures, where we saw the movie of these 3 powerful black women and others navigating that NASA space. Now, for those of us who are familiar with this story, book versus movie version, what is different between the two and is represented in this image? Despite my love for Kevin Costner as Whitney Houston's bodyguard, there was no Kevin Costner in the storyline of Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, and Dorothy Vaughan. Hollywood created Kevin Costner because they said that white people would not relate to this story unless there was a savior in place to mitigate the emotionality that comes with remembering the traumatic histories that have transpired. And so I include this particular image when I ask, what do you see? Because I ask, are you trying to be the bodyguard in saving someone? Or are you trying to understand your relationship to them in ways that allow you to leverage your power and your privilege and your position to elevate their own stories? And when I think about DEI approaches in STEM education and the ways in which we think about diversity and diversifying or including people within our spaces, we typically draw on some of these strategies. But the approach that we take to these strategies are very fairy godmother-like. Where we go out into the inner city of Detroit and we find Cinderella. And we sprinkle our magic on Cinderella so that we can now transform Cinderella and bring Cinderella into our communities of STEM. Thinking about what we're providing them, how we're transforming them, how we're saving them from their poor, low-dunk, despot lived experiences. Why? Because of our perspectives of justice, where we ask questions about what social justice looks like and how, if we're being inclusive and equitable, we're going to give resources to those who don't have resources so that they can begin to access the spaces that we facilitate. Or if we're trying to be intentional, we're going to try to remove some of those barriers to resources, suggesting then this concept that justice is fairness. But what question are we not asking when we take this approach to social justice? Why aren't they playing the game? Why are they standing on the outfield when the rest of the community is sitting in the stadium? Do they even want to watch baseball? Is that really America's pastime? So we have these perspectives of justice where we think that justice is fair, where we think that society is rational, and where we think that in acts of injustice, we have these individual people creating irrational acts. Why? Because we assume through our liberalistic ideologies that we must be good intending people and that we're not trying to cause any hurt, harm. And because we're good intending people, we have to rely and trust the fact that we're making great decisions. Again, not asking who gets to make the decisions. Again, not asking who gets to determine what the injustices are. And again, not even asking what then should justice look like if we're trying to rectify any injustices or inequities that are transpiring. And so now we have this concept of diversity, where we think about numerical representation and presence. We have this concept of inclusion where we think about whose voices are being included or not. We think about equity where we're accounting for barriers and applying resources as a result of it. And then we have this quote unquote newfound thing of anti-racism that, depending on who you're reading, could be a little problematic. All connected then to this practice of justice as fairness, where our underlying conception of normality is still rooted in this culture of whiteness. And what do I mean then by this culture of whiteness? I go back to the legacy and the history and how we understand what represents normality given our legacy and our history, and the ways in which our social institutions were spaces to quote unquote kill the savage and save the man, or how our social institutions were spaces to ensure that people represented 3/5 of a person. To ensure then that through education, we are socializing people into this industrialized perspective of life, where then anything outside of those perspectives were perceived to be illegitimate or wrong and therefore rejected. Which isn't just a culture of whiteness, but actually becomes anti-whiteness. black, where we see the social suffering and resistance connected to the black experience is because the black body is despised. Because of this conception of life post the transatlantic slave trade that was very intentional to commodify people, where we constantly then associate black life with trauma, suffering, and death. Blackness is dark. Whiteness is light. We fear the dark. We walk to the light. All of these socializing messages continue to perpetuate this anti-black sentiment that then impacts how we engage not only ourselves, but other people. And we can look at it then within the concept of science, where our ideologies are built off of, as I was talking earlier, pseudoscientific perspectives, where we had presidents of the United States intentionally say that blacks were inferior, where we had scientists attempting to prove racial superiority based off of brain size, where this concept of Darwinism and social selection then drives a lot of our social hierarchies in terms of class, where we had white, black, brown, yellow, red, actual colors to signify people that then got associated with this arbitrary conception of Caucasian because it was supposed to be connected to the Caucasus Mountains, though it was until we had a full-blood high caste Indian sue the United States under the naturalization law in 1923 that then the Supreme Court said, well, every Caucasian isn't necessarily white. White is understood based off of who white is, and only white can determine what represents white. We see it in our methodological practices, where we praise people like J. Marion Sims as the father of gynecology, not asking questions about the instruments of torture that he was inflicting upon enslaved black women. We talk about the eugenics movement and how it births genetics, the Tuskegee experiment and our connection to epidemiology, or even Henrietta Lacks, and the fact that this woman had her body stolen and has been sold and is continued to be made for profit, and the family can't even access health insurance. That then shows up in these quote-unquote objective practices where we have this very individualistic mindset and approach to success that breeds this notion of competition, proving one's superiority to be able to demonstrate their dominance in this space. And so we see that in the invisibility of black students because of the erasure of black intellectual thought and contributions. We see that in the hypervisibility of black students, where a lot of times black students report feeling like they have to represent their race in every space that they maneuver in. And so they're constantly thinking about where they sit, how they sit, what they do, how they do it, if they're going to get something right or wrong, for fear of perpetuating a stereotype. And that then turns into this practice of mirrorocracy, where we only seek to then identify the token black individuals who represent essentialized lived experiences that associate with our conceptions of success. The stigmatization that then comes through our individualistic practices that look like quote-unquote merit-based performance, or our quote-unquote colorblind, race-neutral, or generalist content, or even these additive approaches to diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we're so focused on bringing people into overtly hostile, toxic, and traumatic spaces that were not designed to consider them as a person. And so if I think about this through P-Vest, I see black students navigating the stressors of STEM, the reactive coping mechanisms that they produce as a result of it, the emergent identities that they may adopt given their navigation, implementing then their life stage outcomes that we track as we talk about presence and retention and matriculation and all of these other higher education statistics. But then I also think about the cycle of the faculty. Google image of a professor, one of the top 5 actually. And what a professor then goes through as they're navigating their own lived experiences, or what an administrator goes through as they're navigating their own lived experiences, or what professional staff go through as they're navigating their own lived experiences, and how a faculty member, given the power afforded to them as a result of the university, reactive coping informs the stress that the Black students face. And to some degree, the reactive coping mechanisms can shape the stress that faculty members face. Though if I were developing a statistical model, I had the dashed line because if we think about who really holds power on campus spaces, despite the agitation that students may do, there's still multiple examples of how things get quashed in university spaces to silence and to erase and to sweep things under the rug. And all of this happens in that nested ecosystem where our classes are nested within our departments, which are nested within our institutions, which are nested within our broader U.S. society and disciplinary cultures. And our DEI endeavors focus right here. What's the stress? What's the reaction? How can we intervene and mitigate without thinking about the norms, the policies, the beliefs, the practices, the root causes that are informing this ecosystem of life that we're navigating in university spaces? And so at this particular point, you all are probably looking at me like, yo, this is a lot. You have just talked about a whole bunch of things. You used a whole bunch of big words. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do this. You said justice and joy. I ain't see not near aspect of joy in your presentation. What am I supposed to be doing at this particular point? I have broke free from the fish tank, and I am now in the ocean trying to figure out how do I get out of this plastic bubble. I use a lot of Disney in my presentations, if you can't tell. I guess this is more Pixar now, though. Well, if you're asking me the question, now what? I'm asking you the question, who do you want to be? And as Lauryn Hill said, if you want to be somebody and you want to go somewhere, you better wake up and pay attention. How are you leveraging your privilege and your power to either explicitly contribute to the perpetuation of oppression versus how are you leveraging your privilege and your power to explicitly combat oppression, specific either to your identity group if you come from a marginalized identity, or as a co-conspirator to someone else's struggle, recognizing that it might not be your struggle, but the power and the privilege that you carry can help advance the outcomes of their struggle. And if you want to be a co-conspirator or a conspirator, the first thing you should do is see the beauty, the boldness, and the brilliance of Blackness as it is in its own right. Where instead of thinking about what's wrong, or what are all of the experiences that have now created this phenomena that we see, we hear, even from the voices of some of the students here at LTU, the strengths that people bring into these spaces. And we build from these strengths rather than trying to fix or fill the deficits. One way we can build from strengths is thinking through a critical strengths-based framework. Community cultural wealth is one of those frameworks, where it's very intentional to talk about the different forms of capital that racially minoritized individuals bring to the table, or even leverage to create their own tables, focusing on aspirations or the power of hopes and dreams, linguistic capital or the different world languages that people speak, or just the different ways that people communicate even if it's not audible, navigational capital, the insight that people develop as they navigate different social spaces. Resistance capital in terms of how they decide to stand firm in who they are and embrace their beauty and their boldness. Familial capital, recognizing the power of families. And even if it is a first-generation college student, there are lessons that the family teaches the person on how to navigate, on how to persist, on how to pursue, and how to communicate, engage in life that might not necessarily be representative, quote unquote, of what we consider to be institutional capital or even social capital. Thinking about the different networks that people have, the power of the barber or the beautician, and what they do in terms of informing a person's lived experience, sometimes being the first line of defense for any kind of mental health crises. Being intentional to critique the deficit approaches and focus on empowering and building from strengths. And here are just a few examples of what it could look like as we think about different students entering into our STEM spaces. Students enter into STEM with dreams. They want to study science because of something they want to do with science. Dr. Ebony McGee at Vanderbilt talks about this as an equity ethic. There's something that I'm going to use my STEM for to enhance either my community's well-being or my own social mobility. Dr. Juan Garibay at Virginia says that as social agency. How are we thinking about the social agency that's connected to our STEM spaces? Thinking about the different languages that people speak and what it affords in terms of this more global perspective, as well as the ability to sweet talk their way through situations. We got a cousin who is amazing because of his gift of gab and can talk his way into anything and out of everything. And that is a capital and a strength that they can use to navigate. And here are ways that we can build it within our programs or even within our teaching and our mentoring, where we not only talk about visions and goal setting, but we think about it intimately connected to the purposes of people as they are exploring their majors. How we leverage like-self near peers to facilitate community. Do we actually affirm people in these spaces? Coming from North Carolina to the Midwest, I'm used to speaking to everybody. Emphasis on the every in my nice little southern drawl. And I come and I see people walking down with their heads down. I'm like, yo, what's good? Hello, I'm a person. Nice to see you. You like to see me too? What does that do in terms of affirming the humanness of people in our spaces so that we're not constantly thinking of them as students or as products, but people? We do things like spotlights. We highlight all the successes, but in the process of highlighting successes, whose stories are we essentializing and whose stories are we leaving out? Because if we only feature the person with the 5.0 GPA who had $100 million in scholarship, who navigated 5 billion applications for college and was invited to go with Elon Musk to the moon, then what does that speak to about everyone else who doesn't live that lived experience? And are they not a valued contributor to our learning environments and spaces? Can we not highlight people for just waking up this morning and coming to class despite the fact that it's cold outside? Right? And in our teaching, we should think about why people actually care to pursue our majors. I'm passionate about what I do because I spent 4 years studying it deeply for my PhD. And now I'm going to assume that everybody is going to love what I do. Not quite. Some people are just now being exposed to it. So if I'm coming with the fire hydrant and I'm going full steam ahead, somebody's going to be looking at me like, why is this even relevant to my lived experience or life? I see no connection between this information and what's next. So beyond that strengths-based approach, then we have to be intentional to think about our power, our privilege, and our positions. Recognizing that across the university ecosystem, we all have assigned roles, quote unquote. And that if we want to think about power within the university ecosystem, we can think about it from a bottom-up, middle-out, or even top-down perspective. But we also then have to think about power assigned to us because of our social identities and the very distinct dichotomies that we've created, where it's white versus of color, where it's cisgendered versus everything else, where it's heterosexual versus everything else, where it's physically and neurologically able versus everything else, where it's middle to high socioeconomic status versus everything else. And the power that comes with our assumptions of normality that we can take for granted even as we inhabit different dominant identities. Yes, I may be targeted because of my race, but because of my cisgenderedness, I have power given to me by society. So how do I then navigate that as I enter into spaces with Black women or Latina women or Chicana women or other women of color? Noting then the differences in how society perceives us, given the differences in our identity. Which means that I'm thinking then, or we should be thinking then, through our spheres of influence. What are the things that we can directly control versus the things that we can directly influence versus the things that we can indirectly influence? And how we're using, again, our power, privilege, position, and platform to either be conspirators or co-conspirators or to perpetuate forms of oppression. Thinking then intentionally about transforming the anti-Black environmental stressors, the systems, the policies, the cultural norms and practices that continue to perpetuate oppression, that require then all of this cognitive magic of people as they're trying to determine what to do, where to do, how to do, when to do, why to do, and in what capacity to do. And we got some pretty good examples of how we can transform anti-Black structures. I got some phenomenal colleagues whose work I draw on sitting right here in this very room. How are we thinking through our teaching? How are we thinking through what we count as knowledge? How are we thinking through our assessments? How are we thinking through the ways in which we're engaging people and perspectives, our hiring practices, our retention practices, our promotion and tenure practices, our celebration practices, our acknowledgement of the true movers of institutions, the groundskeeper and custodial staff, and the administrative staff who keep that business going day by day. While we also facilitate joy, unspeakable joy, if we want to, recognizing that, again, Blackness is more than the trauma and the pain and the social suffering and death that anti-Blackness continues to try and suggest and perpetuate. So I asked this question when you asked me now what, I asked, who do you want to be? But at this particular point, I ask you to show them who you are. Thank you.